gender or female spiritual writers as normative, you may well be familiar with Lavinia Burns' work on the hidden tradition and the hidden voice, her 2 books. But in the hidden tradition, there are 92 women spiritual writers, women theologians, those who have provided spiritual encouragement and those who have written prayers. So just to quote from Lavinia Byrne, the Shaker eldress Rebecca Jackson reminds us that the divine call is all about revelation. In a moment of despair, Rebecca recorded, "I was all alone, had nobody to tell my troubles to except the Lord. I throwed myself on God. I saw that night for the first time a mother in the deity." Teresa of Avila notes, God converted the aridity of my soul into deepest tenderness. Elsie Chamberlain wrote of an exciting, driving sense of vocation. And Charlotte Elliott proclaims in the hymn, "Just as I am, I come." Just in those short few sentences, Rebecca Jackson, a black 19th century preacher in Philadelphia, Teresa of Avila, a 16th century European mystic, Elsie Chamberlain, a 20th century congregational minister, and Charlotte Elliott, a 19th century composer of hymns. Just in those few sentences, we have women spanning the centuries and the continents, and they're not all white, which is absolutely vital. And lastly, who are the illustrations that you listen to or that you use whenever you're talking or preaching? Are there women? And if so, what are they doing? I heard a fantastic talk, using the term ironically, a fantastic talk recently from a preacher who had been preaching for a very long time. It was more of a lecture, I guess, but it was over an hour. And there were no women at all in this talk. There were lots and lots of examples from daily life. Very good, very engaging. He told us about the postman, the conversation he had with the postman. There was a neighbour. There were various other people. They were all men. And just when I was losing the will to live towards the end of this talk, he said, "But at the root of the difficulties in our society is pride, the mother of all sins." It's exactly that, and I work obviously at St Paul's Cathedral, so I hear a lot of different people come to preach a lot of different sermons. Women, men, black, white preachers do not use women or anyone actually other than European or North American men usually to speak with authority, to help us to define where we are. Women are included sometimes, but they're usually as assistants or the people whom we're not supposed to be like. There is still a sense, even with women preachers, and you please extrapolate this to all the other issues we've been talking about today. When did I last use a person with a physical impairment, not as a person who needed to be changed, but as a person who spoke with authority about God? It's the way we quote people, the way we use our stories and illustrations that is very important. And it's not just for those of us who preach, it's for those of us who have to endure our preaching. Challenge your preachers. It's an important aspect. One of the ways I try to be inclusive is to use as a category of people that I'm quoting in a sermon, the people who would not be allowed to preach at St Paul's. So, for example, I might quote the comments of a man who's homeless, who I talk to, who sells The Big Issue, as authoritative, or a woman who is from a different denomination or a different faith, somebody who would not be allowed to preach in the pulpit. Those are the people that I would want to quote in sermons, as an attempt, anyway, to being authoritative. Similarly, on the subject of ethnicity, not stereotyped using people who are black, but using stories that are perhaps not so well known. They're getting a bit more well known now, the story of Harriet Tubman, for example, but others, Sojourner Truth, Rosa Parks, Bessie Smith, they're inspiration for all people, men and women, black and brown and white. For example, the black explorer who I discovered recently, Matthew Henson, who went to the North Pole in 1907, scientists, architects, surgeons, talk about absolutely normative Tabitha the disciple, Junia the apostle, Lydia the businesswoman, Martha the theologian, Mary Magdalene the bearer of good news. How we describe those people is very important, not just mentioning them. That's not what being inclusive means. It doesn't just happen. It requires study and energy and work. But from the list of reactions we've got here, we can see that it's absolutely worth it, not just for the people who are gathered here today, but for all the people we sit next to Sunday after Sunday. Anthologies for where we might go to find ideas are often full of male white leadership and educated class, quotations bringing up the point that was made earlier about education. But to use feminist writers, theologians and biblical studies, as well as black theologians, as well as theologians who've written about disability, not just on a special occasion, but for an ordinary Sunday, when you're not even sure that there is a relevance to the biblical passage that you're reading. That's how to make inclusive language absolutely normative and in the lifeblood of our congregations. I just want to end with a quotation from a Roman Catholic commentator who describes what I think would be a truly inclusive Eucharist. And then just for the last couple of moments, we've got 10 minutes, perhaps to have a discussion about some of the things we've said this morning. So this is in Liturgy and Justice, which is another book that's on your list. Religious rites, worship services, liturgies, are to be banquets of joy and peace. Eating is a moral act, and sometimes a religious act. Yet the gratitude for holy food and the salvation it brings is fully expressed only when we remember that unleavened bread was first eaten by slaves on the run, and the cup of wine is a cup of suffering. Just as I believe bread and wine are transformed, so we are transformed into people of compassion, people who see what others overlook, people who can begin to trace the vague outlines of the prophetic vision of the reign of God, where justice and mercy embrace and a grand table is set, where bankers sit next to farmers, where border guards converse with the undocumented, and ranchers share toasts with environmentalists, where work gloves lie next to linen napkins, hands are scrubbed, feet are washed, thirst is quenched, hunger satisfied, and there's no hint of injustice, no whisper of enslavement, no sign of barbed wire anywhere. That could be Sunday morning in our church.